Right, welcome learners. Today we're going to be learning together about floral anatomy and physiology. Um, there's a lot of terminology involved in floral anatomy, just like there is in human anatomy or any other area of science. There's always a lot of words that you have to know in order to be able to have a conversation about a structurally complex item in all fields. Whether you're a mechanic or whatever, mechanics have to know all of the different parts of an engine. And even though I think that a lot of times learning a large batch of new vocabulary can be um, intimidating, we're going to get through it together. And hopefully, I can explain everything clearly enough that you are able to understand. I'm going to try on every slide to include some kind of discussion about the significance of these this floral anatomy and maybe how it's useful to humans, but also really looking at it from an evolutionary perspective. How are these structures serving the needs and ends of the plant in order to accomplish the plant's goals? Mhm. So, by the end of this, we'll be able to understand really clearly what are flowers, what are the parts of flowers, and how is having a strong knowledge of floral parts valuable to horticulturists or to other people who work in plant sciences. I'm actually going to turn off my camera because I'm afraid that I will be covering a lot of the illustrative photos on each slide. Okay. Okay, so flowers, what are they? Flowers are the plant organ system which is responsible for sexual reproduction. And if you haven't heard of sexual reproduction before, this is a process that we've all seen. It's the process of combining genetic material from two different parents, usually of the same species. Although sometimes plants can form hybrids when two different species produce an offspring, as long as they're very closely related, and they're going to create a genetically unique offspring. So, you might think about features that your biological mother or father have, and you probably have kind of a blend of their characteristics. You inherited some from one and some from another, but you are completely genetically unique. There's no other human being before or after you that's had the exact same combination um, of alleles or versions of those genes. So you are unique. And when plants reproduce through their floral or flower organ systems, they produce seeds which are typically genetically unique. The reason why a plant might want to produce genetically unique offspring that have a random combination of traits rather than having the exact same traits as the parent is this allows a population of plants to experience genetic change over time. We typically refer to this process as evolution, but even over the short term, populations of plants are under all kinds of stresses. Could be drought, could be fire, could be flooding or very cold temperatures, could be extreme heat. Maybe it's changes in humidity. Plants don't have the ability to just get up, run away, hide, go to a stream, drink. They can't do that. So they have to basically adapt almost purely using genetic processes so that the population can continue to exist. So if a plant just produces clones of itself rather than sexual reproduction, which plants are very capable of producing clones of themselves, those clones tend to have the exact same genetic information as the parent. And so if the parent is ill suited to survive on a particular site, maybe it'll survive to produce seed, and maybe there's a chance some of the seeds will be better suited to survive on that site. And those are the ones that will survive and reproduce. And that's what plants are really trying to do with their flowers. Okay. Um, if we look at this diagram here, I love this diagram because it really clearly shows how flowers are modified shoots. Okay, so shoot's just another word for a stem, and we can see that there are multiple layers of these highly modified leaves in a predictable sequence. Okay, we have whorl 1, whorl 2, whorl 3, and whorl 4. And we always count our floral whorls from the bottom or from the outside to the top or the inside. And that helps us clearly identify the different layers of a flower, as it were, and leaves us with a strong ability to look at almost any type of flower and find the floral organs that we're after. Why might we want to find floral organs, you ask? Well, in order to collect male genetic material from one plant and combine it with female genetic material from another plant, we have to be able to identify the male and female parts of a flower. And if we have a good understanding of where we're likely to find them within the structure of any flower, even if we're trying to collect, pollen or seeds from a flower that we have of a species we've never handled before, we're going to be able to easily locate um, those parts in our flower. Okay, so whorl one is the calyx, okay, which is composed of the sepals. We'll talk more about the sepals on a coming slide. The next slide we'll be talking about the corolla, which is composed of the petals, okay, which is whorl two. Our third whorl is the androecium, which is composed of stamens, which produce our male genetic material. And our fourth whorl is the gynecium, also called the carpels or pistils. And that is the fourth whorl, and it's typically found in the center of the flower, and that is where our female reproductive material is produced. Okay, so the sepals. These, if you look at this rose here, you can see these leaf-like um, structures below the flower bud. And you can see that in these flower buds, which are still closed around this rose, those sepals or modified leaves, they're covering and protecting that developing flower bud. Petals tend to be very, very delicate. They tend to be susceptible to damage from rain or sun. Um, and so we want to keep those nice and protected so that they can do their job once the flower opens, their job of attracting pollinators to come and visit the flower. Okay. When we refer to all of the sepals of a flower, we call that the calyx. So we can see here there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sepals protecting each rosebud. And those 5 sepals they make up the calyx. Calyx is a fun word. This is actually a word of Greek origin. And this word is the same root that the word chalice is derived from. Chalice as in like a goblet or a cup. And it's because the calyx makes up this goblet or cup which surrounds the developing flower bud, protecting it. Some plants, for example, if we look at this tulip on the right, you don't really see, green leafy sepals like you do in the rose, but we do see that there's an outer whorl of petals composed of 3 and an inner whorl of petals composed of another 3. And what's really going on here is these outer 3 are whorl 1 of the flower. These are basically the sepals, but because they are indistinguishable from the inner whorl 2, which is composed of 3 petals, we actually refer to all of the petals and sepals in this case as tepals right here. So we could say that a tulip has 3 sepals and 3 petals. But since we can't really tell the difference very easily between the two, we just call them all tepals. Okay. Our second whorl of our flower is the corolla, okay, which is composed of petals. And if we look at, this rose, for example, we can see that there are 5 separate petals that make up the corolla. And this might be the configuration we're most familiar with, is having these separate petals. However, if we look at this rhododendron here, in the top left corner, we can see that the 5 petals are actually fused together. And in a plant like the trumpet vine in orange, in the top left corner, top right corner, we still have 5 petals, but we can see that that tube that they're fused into is actually quite long. And that forces the pollinator to really get down in there in order to access any nectar. Do we have any guesses about what might pollinate these? I'll give you a few seconds to guess. If you thought hummingbirds, you'd be correct. Hummingbirds are very attracted to these red tubular flowers, and only they have a bill and a tongue long enough to reach the nectar, which is stored at the very bottom of this tube that is created by the fused petals. So like I've said, the corolla is all of the petals of a flower collectively. Sometimes it's because they're all fused, sometimes they're separate. We would still call it a corolla. Um, Petals attract pollinators. The petals of the corolla attract pollinators using a variety of strategies. The strategy we're probably the most familiar with because it's the most obvious is color. Petals are brilliantly colored, um, not from an evolutionary perspective to please us. Rather, they have evolved to pigment themselves in colors that are attractive to their pollinators. Um, so, for example, dandelions, if we look down in this bottom right corner, we can see that under normal light, dandelions are yellow. Yellow is a color which is highly attractive to bees. Purple is another color which is very attractive to bees. I've already talked about red being very attractive to hummingbirds. Some night flying pollinators, such as moths, find the color white very attractive because it reflects the light, the limited light which is available at night from the moon and stars and so on, very effectively, which makes those white flowers easier for flying pollinators to find. We also see that there can be patterns, for example, on these rhododendron petals. Sometimes these patterns can't be seen under regular light. We have to use a UV or ultraviolet camera in order to see them. Petals of flowers sometimes have patterns on them which only reflect UV light. Bees can see UV light, and that's what we're seeing on the left-hand side of this photograph of a dandelion in the bottom left corner with the pink and the white. What's really happening is there's this central portion of the flower is not reflecting the same amount of UV light that these outer petals are. And so that basically creates a target for bees to be able to locate the nectar and the pollen in that flower that they're trying to collect as a food resource. Um, Petals often also are capable of releasing um, organic compounds. If you've ever been to the gas station and smelled the gasoline, gasoline evaporates at a very low temperature. So it's very willing to evaporate. It evaporates at much lower temperatures than water will typically start evaporating. And that allows those scents to basically form a scent plume that basically this big cloud of scent, which in the case of plants is used to attract insects. Insects are so small, they actually can sometimes smell plants from a mile away, but they actually have to get quite close to see them due to the structure of their eyes. So that's really basically there are organic compounds evaporating out of the leaf tissue into the air that provide the flower its scent. Um, so, color, scent, patterns, sometimes patterns in UV are all different ways that plants have evolved to attract typically animal pollinators to carry their pollen from one flower to another. We'll talk about that process a little bit more farther on. Um, Not all flowering plants have petals. For example, grasses do produce flowers but don't produce petals. I want you to be thinking about the answer to this question right here. Why not? Okay. The third world is the androecium. Okay. The androecium is the third world. So we have our, on this cactus flower, for example, our sepals back here. We have these, which are our petals. And our third world is these, which are all of our stamens. We can also see them here on this baobab flower, these really long yellow thread-like structures, which are the stamens. Okay. The stamens are composed of three parts. They've got an anther, which is this structure at the end. It produces pollen. Typically, they split open to release that pollen. The next part is the filament, which holds the anther out so it'll contact the body of pollinators, and then the pollen itself, which can be deposited on the body of a pollinator, such as a bee or a butterfly or a hummingbird or a bat or any other number of pollinators to be carried to the next flower. And we call this all the androecium. If you've ever heard of like androgens, testosterone, for example, is an androgen. Those are hormones. They're masculine hormones. Andro is a Greek root which means man. So the androecium, these are the man parts of the flower, essentially. Okay. So the filament, right, we said is this thread which holds the anther, which is the pollen-bearing structure, out to deposit pollen on the bodies of pollinators. And we can see that in different species, these filaments can be very different lengths, or even in different parts of the flower, as in these foxglove. In this plant right here, which is Caesalpinia, we've got really long filaments. And so if a tiny little bee decides to fly into this flower, it's not really very likely to pick up very much pollen because all of the anthers are spread out very far and they're very far away from the flower. And if the bee decides to fly in from the side, it's not going to contact the pollen-bearing anthers at the ends of these filaments at all. Um, Whereas a small flower like this with very short filaments is going to allow these to contact the bodies of any bee which crawls into this flower. So this is probably a flower that has evolved to be pollinated by smaller bodied insects such as bees. And a flower like this Caesalpinia, which has really, really long, fantastically long filaments, is probably pollinated by butterflies, and it's probably depositing its pollen on the underside of the wing of the butterfly. You can imagine that if a large butterfly tries to land on this flower to drink nectar, it's going to have to force its way down through these stamens, and it's going to get absolutely covered in pollen. In foxglove, the filaments actually run at the very top of this fused corolla or these fused petals. And what that means is when a bumblebee crawls into this tube, all of the pollen is only found at the top of the tube. So that bumblebee will get pollen deposited only on its back, which means when it then visits the next flower and runs into this pistil, it's going to very easily transfer pollen between different flowers and pollinate with really high efficiency. A plant like this is not going to have to produce as much pollen because it's controlling the placement of the pollen to ensure that it's carried exactly correctly, whereas other flowers might want to completely cover the body of their pollinator in pollen in order to guarantee that no matter what, it will pollinate the next flower it visits. The anther is this portion at the end of the stamen. Here we've got a whole stamen, and it produces pollen. The pollen is actually produced inside of the anther. And when the flower first opens, these anthers are often not fully mature, and um, they will not look dry and dusty like these reddish anthers you see in this top right corner. Often they'll look smooth, and that's because they haven't dehissed or split open yet. So once the pollen grains are mature and they're ready to be, picked up by a pollinator and carried to another flower, those anthers will split open. They will often sometimes turn themselves inside out to reveal that pollen, and then that pollen is free to contact the body of a pollinator and be carried somewhere else. Um, One thing that can be a little tricky when we talk about the female parts of the flower is we really do have kind of this stick and pad setting with the female flower parts as well. We'll learn what those are called in a second. We can always tell the male parts from the female parts of a flower because first of all, they'll kind of look dry and dusty, these anthers will, but also um, we can look at the floral whorls and say, okay, what layer of the flower is that coming from? Is it coming from whorl 1, whorl 2, whorl 3? If it's coming from whorl 3, then we know that it's male reproductive structure. Okay. Pollen. So pollen grains are often thought of as plant sperm, but this is not technically correct. Pollen grains are actually a tiny They call them a gametophyte. So the correct way to think about pollen grains from an evolutionary perspective is that this is actually its own organism. The pollen grain is its own organism that has its own short life. And its job as this tiny, tiny, tiny little male plant is to go share its genetic information with a tiny, tiny little female plant. And when they are able to do that, they'll be able to produce a big sporophyte, which is the big bodied plants that we're used to seeing, um, in gardens and parks and in nature. Um, if we look at the inside of this pollen grain, we can see that the structure is quite simple. We've got this outer structure, which is called the exene, which is made of sporopollenin. I'm not going to expect you to know that, but that's basically to protect the pollen grain. Then we have the intine, or this inner lining, which is made of cellulose. And then we have really just two cells inside. We have the tube cell and we have the generative cell. The tube cell, we will learn, burrows a tube down to what will eventually become the seed in the female flower part. The generative cell will divide in two to make two sperm cells, and we will see that diagrammed later. These germ pores, or these breaks in the exene, or outer coating of this pollen grain, that's what allows the tube cell to begin to burrow down into the female parts of the flower in order to deliver sperm to the egg. And we'll see that in a diagram farther along. If we look down at this photograph in the bottom left corner, we'll see that different species of plants can have pollen grains which look very, very, very different from each other. Sometimes they're covered in spikes, sometimes they're round, sometimes they're really, really itty bitty. And when we look at those structures, we have to always keep in mind that there is often an evolutionary reason for that kind of texture, shape, or structure. Um, for example, this is just me hypothesizing. I don't know what species are represented here, but we see this very large grain covered in spikes. I imagine, and I don't know, I'd have to go look at the scientific research on the subject, but I imagine that these spikes perhaps help that large, heavy pollen grain cling effectively to the body of a pollinator like a bee, and that these really small pollen grains maybe don't need to have spikes because perhaps they're blown on the wind and they just need to be really, really tiny so that they can easily get from one plant to another on light air currents. Okay, our fourth whorl. So this is the centermost whorl of the flower. And if we go back a few slides, oh, it won't let me. Um, These are the centermost whorl, and they're the female reproductive organs of a flower. The reason I say female in quotations is male and female for plant reproduction are not equivalents of male and female parts for animals. Plants evolved their own methods of sexual reproduction completely separately from animals. And so they have slightly different ways of doing things. So we understand them as female, but they're not really, female in the same way that animals are male or female. Um, so a carpel is one of the female reproductive organs of a flower. And when we look at a carpel, typically they look something like this. Down at the bottom, we see one pistil, one carpel, and I'll explain the difference between pistil and carpel. A carpel is basically one little chamber which contains some spores like pollen, which we call ovules, which are basically going to develop into the seeds after they're pollinated. And I think that it's useful to understand some evolutionary background in order to understand how this came to be. When we look at some ancient groups of plants that have been around for millions of years, like ferns, for example, we see that the ferns still produce their spores exposed to the air on the undersides of the leaves. And what flowering plants decided to do millions of years ago is they took those leaves, which had spores born on the outside of the leaf, and they decided to start wrapping those up to both protect them and to allow for more elaborate developmental processes to occur, so that their spores stood a greater chance of surviving after they were released into the environment. So you can see that over time, this leaf gradually rolled up, it sealed itself shut, and then some plants started to put multiple of these rolled up leaves containing spores together to create what we call a pistil. So a pistil is a single or multiple fused carpels, and they operate as a unit. So when we look here in this top right corner, we see we've got a stigma, style, ovary, and ovule. This is one pistil, and it could be composed of one or more carpels that have been fused together. If we look down at this bottom diagram, we can see that one carpel can make up a pistil. We can also have three separate carpels, which operate as their own independent pistils, or we could have three carpels that have all fused together, and we would refer to them as one pistil. We could even have these structures here at the top, these styles fused together in many plants. And so sometimes it looks like it's all one unit, but really we've got multiple carpels that can fuse together to form a pistil. And when we talk about flowers that maybe have multiple pistils and multiple carpels, we have to refer to that using the collective term of gynoecium. So the gynoecium is composed of all of the carpels of a flower collectively. So we could have multiple pistils or multiple carpels in the fourth whorl of a flower. Okay. So when we look at pistils or carpels in a flower, we always find at the very top a structure called the stigma. And I like to teach students to remember what this thing does by calling it the sticky stigma. So your sticky stigma, when it is mature, because often when flowers first open, it is not yet mature and might look dry. Once it's mature and ready to receive pollen, it will develop a sticky or shiny appearance. Um, and this is the part of the uh, pistil that the pollen is collected by in order to be used to fertilize the ovules inside of the ovary chamber. Um, that process of becoming sticky is called receptivity. If your stigma is not yet receptive, it does you absolutely no good to pollinate your flower because the stigma won't accept the pollen. So you have to be watching that stigma and figure out, when in the life cycle of this flower is that stigma receptive to pollen and actually be sticky and allow the pollen to begin the process of fertilization. The style is the next portion of our carpels or pistils, and not all plants have a very long style. Sometimes the stigma essentially sits right on top of the ovary, but the style basically exists to make sure that the stigma is able to collect pollen from the body of a pollinator. So depending on the size or shape of the body of the pollinator, which typically visits that flower, that stigma may be longer or shorter or have a slightly different shape. Sometimes it might be curved in order to guarantee that it's able to make contact with the body of the pollinator and collect pollen which has been brought from a flower of the same or a very closely related species. You may have heard of a stylus. You may have used a stylus, for example, on a iPad or on a computer screen. Stylus is just the Latin word for pen. So style comes from that Latin word stylus, meaning pen, which is very descriptive of the shape. The ovary. The ovary is this chamber at the base of the pistil, and it will eventually, after the flower has been pollinated and the seeds fertilized, it will swell and develop into a fruit. And the ovary contains the ovules. We'll talk about ovules a little bit more on the next slide. They develop into the seeds of the plant. And we can see in this dissected um, daffodil, we can see these little little white immature ovules inside of the chamber of the ovary, and we can see the style and stigma. The stigma would have collected pollen, and the pollen would have made a tube through here. We'll see how that happens and reach the ovules in order to fertilize them. Um, One thing we should be aware of when we're talking about the ovary is placentation. So may have heard of the placenta in mammals, including human beings. The placenta is an organ that the fetus or the baby makes in order to receive nutrition from the mother in order to fuel its growth. And in plant ovaries, we can see that there can be many different arrangements or many different placentation patterns, meaning there's a lot of different ways that our developing ovules can receive nutrition from the ovary, from the mother plant, in order to develop into mature seeds. Marginal is when they're just along one edge. Axile is when they're on this little axis in the center, or like an axle. Parietal is when they're on the walls. Free central is basically the same as axile, but we've decided to lose evolutionarily the walls along that support that central beam. Um, in plants with a really simple ovaries, we might just have one seed, and maybe it's attached to the bottom or the top. We call that basal or apical. We could maybe have a couple seeds that are attached in that way, or ovules, I should say. Um, but those are some basic types of placentation, and this is really used quite frequently to figure out what plants are related to other plants, because within a particular evolutionary group, plants tend to have similar flower structure and similar organization of the different carpels which form the pistil. Okay, the ovule. The ovule is essentially a kind of elaborate spore which produces the female gamete or the egg cell of the plant. The ovule, in its entirety, will develop into a seed once it's fully been fertilized. So we can see that just one of the cells in the ovary is the egg cell. This funiculus is a structure which connects the ovule to the wall of the ovary. So basically, it connects the seed to the wall of the fruit. Next time you eat an apple, maybe you can see the funiculus inside of the apple that connects the seed to the flesh of the apple. Um, so the pollen has to basically get a spore all the way down to this egg and fertilize it. Okay, so when we are talking about the process of pollination, the first thing that has to happen is a pollen grain has to be deposited on our sticky stigma. If we remember the tube cell, which made up the majority of the volume of the pollen grain, the tube cell is really, really large because it has to have the resources required to burrow a hole through the style, or basically dig a tube. A lot of students that maybe know a little bit about flowers already, I find they often assume that there maybe already is a tunnel through the style, but that's not the case. The pollen grain has to dig its own tunnel down to the ovules. While that tunnel is being dug, the generative cell, this little blue dot, the generative cell actually divides to produce two sperm. And the two sperm are really, really important in flowering plants. The first sperm arrives and fertilizes the egg. The second sperm fertilizes this cell called the polar nuclei. And this is what's going to grow and develop into the food or the endosperm of the seed. And we'll talk more about that later. But once the egg has been fertilized, we call it a zygote. That's just a fertilized egg cell, and it's going to develop into the embryo, which we can find inside of a seed. Um, and the ovule, after being fertilized, will develop into a seed, so long as everything goes correctly from a developmental standpoint. Pollinators are the animals which do the work of carrying pollen between flowers in order for that process of fertilization to be able to take place. And certainly we might be familiar with organisms such as bees or butterflies, but there are many other pollinators besides bees and butterflies. Notably, we can be pollinators. We see this photo of someone pollinating some either melon or cucumber blossoms. I'm not sure which in this case. They're very closely related plants. They look very similar. Um, but it can also be, hummingbirds, bats, lizards. It can be a whole bunch of different kinds of animals. When people are pollinating our crops, often we do it because there's not a strong population of pollinators that are present in order to do that work for us for free, or because we want to have control over the reproductive process of plants. Because when wild pollinators like butterflies or bees or hummingbirds do pollination, it's relatively random. All the bee or butterfly or hummingbird is trying to do is get a meal. A hummingbird is visiting flowers primarily to drink nectar, which is sugar. Bees are visiting flowers to drink the nectar for energy and also collect pollen as a protein source to feed to their bee larvae in their hive. Um, Bats are consuming mostly the nectar because it's rich in sugars that they can use to fuel their flight. Um, so the pollinator is really just in it for a meal. They don't know that they are providing an essential service for the plant. The plant is essentially providing some kind of reward in order to pay them, pay the pollinator, or trick them into performing pollination services for them. Um, so when we want to have control, we can pick a parent, pick a male parent, pick a female parent, and perform pollination. But if we use wild pollinators, we don't really know what's going to happen because they're just trying to get a meal and live in their lives, which doesn't really allow us to make controlled crosses between maybe two plants that have really desirable traits that we might be interested in, um, enhancing in our crops, for example. Okay, so pollination, we've talked about this a little bit already. This is the process by which pollen from the anthers or from whorl 3. So here we've got the sepals or calyx. Here we've got the petals or corolla. Here we have the stamens or andrecium. And here we have the pistils or gynoecium. We can do pollination a couple different ways. Um, the only two ways I really care that you know are self-pollination and cross-pollination. So self-pollination can occur in two different ways. It can occur between two flowers on the same plant. It can occur within a flower on the same plant, or it can occur between separate plants. And there are terms for these like natogamy, xenogamy, and autogamy. But I really want you to know that self-pollination is when a plant's flowers are pollinated by its own pollen. This would be kind of like if you were able to have a child with yourself. Um, when only one parent organism is involved in sexual reproduction, you have really limited genetic options. Two separate, unrelated individuals, have double the amount of genetic possibilities in the offspring as an individual reproducing with itself. So that really limits the genetic options of a plant and also its adaptability to its environment. If a plant is able to cross-pollinate and get genetic resources from another plant, there's a greater likelihood that a number of seeds within that batch have desirable characteristics and are able to survive in a challenging, changing environment. Um, if it self-pollinates, it's only got its own genetic toolbox to work with, which might limit its options. So a lot of plants have actually evolved self-incompatibility, which means that they basically they cannot pollinate themselves. There's a lot of different ways plants can do this. They can use it, they can evolve genetic mechanisms to basically recognize their own pollen and reject it. They can have structural adaptations. For example, maybe the pollen matures and is released long before the pistil is ready, and so all the pollen will already have blown away or been carried away by pollinators before the female part of the flower is ready to accept pollen. Or it could be the other way around. Maybe the female part of the flower receives pollen, then it dries up and becomes unreceptive, and then the flower releases its pollen. There's a lot of different ways in which plants can encourage cross pollination and limit their own self pollination in order to make sure that they have a very adaptable, that basically they're able to acquire genetic information from other plants in order to have very diverse and adaptable seedling offspring. So in order to attract pollinators to do the work of pollination, we have to pay them, right? So plants have evolved organs called nectaries, which are glands. And glands are basically organs that secrete some kind of fluid, typically. In the case of nectar, this is basically a sugar solution. Um, Plants are doing photosynthesis and making sugars using water and carbon dioxide, the energy from sunlight. So plants are really the only organisms that can make new sugars, which means that it's kind of a unique resource that plants can offer to animals in order to reward them for doing pollination tasks. If we're familiar with honey, or if you watch the bee movie, you may be familiar that with the fact that honeybees make their honey from nectar. Honey isn't just nectar that the bees have collected and put in their hive. It does undergo some chemical and mechanical processes. The bees actually heat it and fan it with their wings in order to get it to dry up a little bit and become more concentrated. And that helps it store better in their hive. Um, but that's something of concern if you're a beekeeper, is you want to make sure that there are lots of flowers that produce lots of nectar in the feeding area that those bees have access to. um, there are some flowers which produce more nectar than others. Some flowers don't produce nectar at all, and they're using other methods to attract pollinators, such as producing large amounts of pollen, or sometimes maybe even trickery to attract pollinators to get them to do pollination work without actually paying them. Okay, not all plants produce petals. We talked about that earlier. When plants are pollinated by the wind, they do not need to have petals because they don't attract pollinators. A really good example in this top photo are grasses. We can see these little thread-like structures hanging from each grass flower that have these yellow organs on them. I'll give you a second to guess what those might be. If you guessed anthers, you'd be correct. These are the male reproductive organs which are producing pollen, and the female reproductive organs, or the pistils, the stigmas, those are these feathery white structures here. So the pollen is blowing off of the anthers into the wind, and then these net-like sticky stigmas of the female part of that flower, those are collecting that pollen, and the pollen is then making a tube down to the ovary into the ovule to fertilize it so that a seed can develop. Many trees also are wind pollinated. For example, this is the branch of a hazelnut. We have here clusters of male flowers which release huge amounts of pollen that can blow on the wind. And right here we've got a tiny little female flower which has no petals, but it does have an ovary and a stigma, and any pollen that sticks to this red stigma is going to be able to fertilize the hazelnut ovule, which will develop into a hazelnut seed inside of this little fruit. The receptacle is an important flower part that does not make up one of the floral whorls. So when we look at this floral anatomy diagram, we can count our floral whorls. Whorl 1 is called the calyx and is composed of sepals. Whorl 2 is called the corolla and is composed of petals. Whorl 3 is composed of is called the andrecium and is composed of stamens, and whorl 4 is the gynecium and is composed of pistils or carpels. The receptacle is the portion of shoot tissue or stem tissue to which all of the floral organs are anchored. And the receptacle can be configured in a number of different ways. It can be hypogynous, meaning that it's hypo. If you've ever heard of like hypothermia, which is when your body temperature is too low, Hypo means below. Gyne, if you know what a gynecologist is, that's a female reproductive doctor. So hypogyne means below woman. And if we think about the female part of the flower being the pistils, we can see that the hypogynous receptacle is below the female reproductive parts of the flower. A perigynous receptacle is one that wraps around the ovary but does not engulf it. An epigynous, epi meaning on top of, gyne meaning woman or female, epigynous is a receptacle which is on top of the ovary. So it wraps all the way around the ovary. And this is the case in many of our popular fruits, such as kiwis and apples, which is why at the top of an apple you find the stem, and at the bottom of the apple, in that little crevice in the butt of the apple, you do find the remnants of the sepals, or these little leaves which protected the flower bud before it opened. I'm not going to expect you to know the different types of receptacle. I'm not going to expect you to know the names, but it's very useful to understand the receptacle can actually wrap around and engulf the ovary, because that explains why sometimes we have sepals at the bottom of the ovary and sometimes we have sepals at the top of the ovary. Because for a lot of people that doesn't really make sense. How could the sepals be above the ovary when we understand, where our floral whorls are? It has to do with the receptacle basically having been stretched out by evolution to cover up that ovary. And inflorescence. The inflorescence is one of the most interesting things that plants do in order to maximize the likelihood that they will be able to be effectively pollinated. The inflorescence is essentially a system of stalks that bear a plant's flowers, and it would include the flowers that it bears. Um, when we look at an inflorescence or these groupings of flowers that plants produce, um, we might ask ourselves, why? Why is it more advantageous for a plant to clump all of its flowers together than have them all, single, separate, scattered all the way across the plant? And the answer to that is it's a lot more efficient to have them all in one place. If a bee lands on the sunflower, for example, we can see all these tiny little flowers, which each individually have 5 petals that are arranged in this disc. A lot of people look at a sunflower and say that it's just one flower, but a sunflower is actually an inflorescence. It's a giant disc composed of hundreds of tiny little flowers that each have their own 5 little yellow petals and their own stamens and pistils inside of each little flower. So that means that if a bee visits a sunflower, it can pollinate potentially hundreds of flowers in a single visit without having to sit there and fly between flowers. So it's more efficient in terms of time for pollinators, and it's more efficient for the plant because the pollinator doesn't have to continuously go and find a new tiny separate flower. It can just find all of the flowers in one place. And once it can pollinate them all. When we talk about the individual flowers, for example, any one of these tiny little flowers within the sunflower disc, we refer to those sometimes as florets. You can just call them flowers, but floret is a tiny flower within an inflorescence. We also could look at this wisteria flower here in purple on the top right corner, and we see that they're individual little flowers. Each one of those is a flower, but it's a floret within this larger structure, which bears a grouping of flowers. In an inflorescence, we've got 2 main types of stalks, which are modified stems. We've got the peduncle and the pedicel. And the peduncle bears the entire inflorescence. A pedicel is a stalk that bears a single floret within that inflorescence. So, for example, if we look at these flowers, we would say that this is the peduncle because it bears one flower. So that one flower is the entire inflorescence. When we look at this wisteria, we might say that this stalk, which goes down the middle of the inflorescence, is the peduncle, but the flower, the tiny little stalk that goes to each individual floret, is a pedicel. We'll look at more examples of peduncles and pedicels as we continue learning about inflorescences. So indeterminate inflorescences are those which essentially continue to grow. So if we look at these diagrams here, we see that we've either got a green triangle or a red circle. A red circle indicates a flower bud, and a green triangle indicates a vegetative bud, which means it's going to be able to continue to grow new tissues. So indeterminate or racemose inflorescences, they actually can continuously grow, and as they grow, they will bloom from the bottom up. A really good example is a simple raceme. So we have this shoot, which is growing continuously, and as it grows, the flowers at the bottom develop first, and they open sequentially as this raceme continues growing, which allows that indeterminate inflorescence to bloom over a longer period of time. Um, so we see that this has a peduncle, which is this central stalk, which bears the entire inflorescence. And then we have these little stalks that go to each flower, which are pedicels. Here, with a spike inflorescence, we have a peduncle, but we basically have squashed our pedicels. The flowers are instead directly attached to the peduncle. We can have um, compound racemes too that have branching in them. A panicle is basically a relatively disorganized, large, indeterminate inflorescence. We can have a thyrse, which is composed of little clusters along the florets along the peduncle. We can have an ament or catkin, which is basically just the reverse of a spike or raceme. These are hanging rather than growing upright. Um, a spadix is a special type of inflorescence. This is a little bit hard to talk about without a diagram, but if you've ever grown peace lilies or anthuriums, you might be familiar with a spadix. Basically, that's the little sausage-looking thing in the middle of the flower, and it is covered in tiny little flowers. It's not really a flower. The entire thing is an inflorescence. Corymbs tend to branch such that all the flowers are relatively even, but you'll notice that the pedicels do not emerge all from the same point. Sometimes we have branches on branches, in which case we say that they're compound. Umbels have pedicels which all emerge from the same single point, and they tend to be either rounded or flat or compound, but they tend to be kind of umbrella shaped. And then we also can have a disc or kind of a cone, and we call that a capitulum. And this is really what a sunflower is working with. Sunflowers kind of have this rounded dome, which is covered in tiny little florets. And if we go back, no, we can't go back. We can see that there are essentially little tiny florets all over the disc of that flower. So these are some different types of indeterminate inflorescences. And you might be wondering, why does a horticulturist need to know this? It's important to know because you can make a lot of inferences about which plants are related to others. Being able to identify either blooming inflorescences or dried up inflorescences helps you be able to locate and collect seed after the flowering process is finished. So being able to describe and locate inflorescences on a plant is a very valuable skill to have. Determinate inflorescences I'm not going to talk quite as much about. Determinate means that that terminal bud, the bud at the very end of the shoot, actually blooms first. So they bloom from the tip back, essentially, right? So they're going to grow a flower, they're going to bloom, they're going to branch, they're going to bloom, they're going to branch, they're going to bloom, they're going to branch, they're going to bloom. And there's obviously a lot of different ways to do this, but these are really called cymes. And then there's a lot of different types of cymes that are basically varying in complexity. But these are just called determinate or cymose inflorescences. And they're called determinate because the length of each stem is determined by when that flower blooms, and then it can't continue growing for an indeterminate amount of time. It has a determined amount of time that it can grow for before it stops and blooms. Okay, monocots. We're going to talk more about this in our unit on seeds, but monocots are basically a major grouping of flowering plants from an evolutionary perspective that all share a common ancestor. These plants tend to have floral parts in multiples of 3. So for example, if we look at this trillium here, we can see that there are 3 petals, there are 3 sepals, there are 6 stamens, there are 3 carpels. If we look at this lily here, we can see that there are 3 sepals and 3 petals, or we could say that they're all tepals. We have 6 stamens and we have 1 pistil. So we've always got multiples of 3 in when we're counting these floral parts. Dicots are the other major group of flowering plants. They're often called eudicots. That'll probably be the word I use as we move forward, is eudicots. They tend to have floral parts in multiples of 4 or 5. So if we look at this scarlet pimpernel, and if you've seen the movie, this is the flower that the character is named after. We can see that in whorl 1 we have 5 sepals. In whorl 2 we have 5 petals. In whorl 3 we have 5 stamens, and in whorl 1 we have 1 pistil. Another good example of a dicot flower or eudicot flower is the Idaho state flower, Philadelphus lewisii, which has 4 petals. So dicots, this other major group of flowering plants, they tend to have floral parts in multiples of 4 or 5, and that can be certainly useful for figuring out on a kind of a big level what plant group are we looking at. So the examples I've shown you so far have all had both male and female reproductive organs within the same flower, and this is not always the case. Some plants like lilies, we can see clearly that we have 6 stamens and 1 pistil. So we have both male and female reproductive organs within the same flower. So we would describe this flower as perfect. Not all plants do this. If we look at this lower picture of a squash, we can see that this flower right here on the bottom has a very large thickened structure at the base of the petals, at the base of the corolla. And this large thickened structure, if you guessed ovary, that is correct. This is what will develop into a zucchini, which is the fruit of a squash plant. If we look here at this flower, we see that there is not a thickened structure. There is no ovary. This is a male flower, which will only produce pollen. So we can look at either the presence or absence of some of these floral organs to determine the sex of these flowers. So perfect flowers contain both male and female reproductive organs. Imperfect flowers contain reproductive organs of only one sex. It's very unusual to find flowers that are perfect or bisexual on a squash plant, just like it's very rare to find flowers with reproductive organs of only one sex in lilies. Monoecious and dioecious are terms which are often mixed up with perfect or imperfect, but they are not the same. Monoecious plants have flowers or organs of both sexes on the same plant. So when we looked at the squash plant, it had both male and female flowers on the same plant. So we would say that a squash plant is monoecious. If we look at this cherry tree, we see that there are both male and female reproductive organs in each flower on this cherry tree. So we could say that a cherry was also monoecious. Some botanists would actually split out a separate term and say that they are synoecious, which is a slightly different term with its own definition. But they essentially have both male and female reproductive parts on the same plant. Mono, if you've ever heard of like mononucleosis, or I'm trying to think of another word with mono in it, but mono means one. And then this ish part comes from the same root as eco, or like ecosystem or economics, and that means house. So monoecious means one house. So they've got flowers. So they've got flowers or organs of both male and female sexes on the same plant. So they're both living in the same house or one house. Dioecious means 2 houses. So we have, in this case, male flowers on one plant and female flowers on a different plant. So if we look at the flowers of hollies, for example, an individual holly tree will be either male or female. Not, they will never have perfect flowers. If we look at this male flower, we can see that we still have all the floral whorls. Here are petals, here are stamens, here is our pistil, but the pistil is underdeveloped. It's kind of similar to how adult male human beings do possess nipples, but they're not actually effective mammary glands for producing milk. There's a failure to develop in this case. Looking at the female holly trees flowers, we see that we have petals. We have a very well developed ovary with a stigma pad on the top. But the anthers and the anthers of the stamens aren't developed. We don't see any of this yellow dusty pollen that we see on the male flower. So these are underdeveloped stamens and anthers, and they will not be capable of producing pollen. And in this case, if you want a female holly to produce berries, for example, for maybe you want to cut some boughs for Christmas displays, you would have to have another holly tree that produces male flowers planted close enough for cross-pollination to occur between the two in order to ensure that your female holly tree developed berries, those red berries for winter. Complete flowers. Once again, this is often confused with perfect and imperfect flowers. Perfect and imperfect has to do with whether they have both male and female parts, or only male or only female parts. Complete and incomplete has to do with the presence or absence of parts from the floral whorls. So a complete flower has all four floral whorls fully developed. So when we look at this scarlet pimpernel, all four floral whorls are fully developed. We have the calyx, which is composed of the sepals. We have the corolla, which is composed of the petals. We have the androecium, which is composed of the stamens, which are yellow. And then we've got this little green stigma and this fat, fuzzy ovary, which is the gynecium, which is composed of carpels or pistils. Incomplete flowers are lacking one or more of those parts or whorls. So when we look at this flower here, we see that there's an ovary in the center, and we do see that we have stamens, but the petals really haven't developed. We just have these tiny little white things, and then we have really large sepals on the back. So we would say that this flower is incomplete. It is lacking functional petals, and that can certainly be an interesting trait that we see in a lot of plants. Incomplete flowers are very common in species of plants which are pollinated by wind because they don't need pollen. Sorry, they do need pollen. They don't need petals to attract pollinators because the wind is doing the work of spreading their pollen from one plant's flowers to the next. And really, why is this information important? In horticulture, there are hundreds or thousands of people at different levels employed as plant breeders. Some plant breeders have a master's degree in genetics, and they are really directing the work of greenhouse technicians who are doing the actual work of pollinating flowers, doing targeted crosses between a desirable male variety and a desirable female variety in order to produce seed for a variety of reasons. Plant breeders' main goals are usually to develop new varieties and cultivars. Every seedling that you get is unique genetically. And if you can produce the perfect genetic offspring, then you can reproduce it using cuttings or any of the other types of vegetative propagation techniques, which allow us to make a clone, essentially, of that original ideal plant. We can also improve plant performance and productivity. For example, if we look at these two lower pictures of these strawberry plants, on the left, we have a picture of a wild strawberry, and we can see that the strawberries are so small that the plant is able to hold them up off the ground above the leaves so that birds can see them and come and eat them. And then the birds are able to spread the seeds of the strawberry in their dung. Human beings have intervened, and we've selected and reproduced the strawberry plants which had the largest fruit. So in our domestic strawberries, which we can see on the right, we've bred them to produce much larger fruit and many more fruit in order to maximize the productivity of that crop. So we're able to produce a lot more fruit. But these strawberry plants probably wouldn't survive super well in the wild because it would be challenging for a bird to easily see and eat that whole fruit in one bite and carry it to a new part of the forest. So this wild strawberry is highly adapted for surviving under wild environmental conditions. But our domestic strawberries, we have, selected parent plants which were highly productive, crossed them together over many, many generations in order to substantially improve their performance. The last thing we might be interested in using plant breeding for is producing really high quality seed for commercial horticultural purposes. So when you go to a seed catalog to order seed of maybe purple petunias, you can order seed that is guaranteed that every single seed in that entire batch is going to give you a purple petunia. But petunias can come in a wide range of different colors. So it requires really highly controlled pollination processes to ensure that you're able to maintain a genetically pure line of petunias where all of the seeds and all of the offspring will be the same color. So that's another reason why plant breeders do the work they do, is to produce some of our high value horticultural seed, which can then be sold to growers for growing on and producing a sellable plant product. Okay, there we go. Can you hear me again? So the actinomorphic flowers are radially symmetrical. So we could split this flower along any of 5 lines of symmetry and still basically be looking at the same flower. We could make a line here, we could split it here, we could split it here, or we could split it here, and we'd have essentially the same thing on either side. Zygomorphic flowers are bilaterally symmetrical, meaning that you can only draw one line of symmetry and the two sides, that's why it's bilateral, bi meaning two, lateral meaning side, are basically going to be the same. And there are benefits and disadvantages to these two different arrangements. Um, Actinomorphic flowers have less efficient pollination. The pollinator can approach the flower from any angle, but the pollination is less targeted and is more random. Usually the goal is basically to cover the whole body of the pollinator in pollen so that it's more likely to successfully transfer pollen to the next flower. But this arrangement does allow the flower to be more flexibly pollinated by a greater range of different species of pollinators. Zygomorphic flowers, being bilaterally symmetrical, are able to fit the bilaterally symmetrical bodies of animals. Animals have bodies that you can only draw one line of symmetry through. You can only draw one line down your face or down the back of a bee and have the same mirror image on either side, which is basically what symmetry is, mirror image. So if a bee crawls into one of these foxglove flowers on the bottom here that are bilaterally symmetrical, that foxglove, like we talked about earlier, can deposit that pollen in a really targeted way on the back of the bee to guarantee that the pollen is deposited onto the stigmas of the next flower the bee visits. Unfortunately, foxglove flowers really only fit bees, especially bumblebees. So the foxglove doesn't have as many pollinator options as an apple tree, for example, that we see up top, because it has a flower that has kind of a lock and key fit with its pollinator. And there are pros and cons to that, but something to be aware of. Horticulturally, people are very, very interested in the number of petals a flower has. The reproductive organs of a flower are typically not the reason people are buying them. Typically, people are buying them for the petals because they're interested in the color. Normally, wild plants have what we call single flowers, so they have just one layer of petals or whatever layer, however many petals is normal for that wild species. Double flowers are those that people have selected to produce extra whorls of petals. So they're basically adding more and more and more petals and additional floral whorls of them. Some have semi-double flowers that have a lot of extra petals, but maybe the reproductive parts are still visible or they're still present. Fully double flowers sometimes don't have any reproductive parts at all. Sometimes they've been replaced by petals. In the case of roses, roses typically still have stamens and pistils in the center. They still have whorls 3 and 4, but often those reproductive organs are inaccessible because they're completely obscured and covered by just an insane number of petals. And we say that flowers like this are fully double. And the last thing I'd like to talk about is there are a lot of species of plants that have really heavily modified some of those floral whorls. So it can be very challenging as a new plant hybridizer or a new plant breeder to figure out what you're even looking at. For example, these orchid flowers at the bottom, which are pink, they actually store their pollen in special little pouches called pollinia, and you have to know exactly where to find them in the flower and then where the stigma is. And it's not as intuitive as you'd think. It's really, really helpful to go talk to someone who has experience in pollinating orchids or go consult a diagram to figure out where do you get the pollen and where do you put the pollen in the flower in order to make a it makes it make a pollination. Irises are another group of plants that have very structurally complex, unusual, modified flowers, and so are canna. So if you're interested in any of these flowers that maybe don't fit the normal mold, it's really helpful to consult a diagram or an expert to make sure that you are pollinating them correctly, so that you're able to pick a male parent, pick a, that's going to supply pollen, pick a female plant parent that's going to produce the seeds and make hybridizations to your heart's content. You never know. You might be the person to develop the next really cool variety of, I don't know, whatever group of plants you love to work with. Maybe it's roses, maybe it's irises, who knows? So that's been my presentation on floral anatomy and physiology. Um, if you have any questions, feel free to um, comment or talk to me during my office hours, and we'll figure it out. Have an excellent day. Bye.